Hello and welcome to this video on economic growth. Now in this unit we're thinking about the macroeconomy, that is the economy as measured by national boundaries. So my question for you is, how might we measure the size of the economy? What number would we use to say that one economy perhaps is bigger than another? What sort of things would we add up? You might want to pause the video for a second, have a quick think about this question. So some ideas might include the amount of resources available to that economy, the number of workers or the amount of capital within the economy, how rich the country is. Perhaps you'd measure it by saying how happy people are, how many goods and services are produced, the number of them, the volume, or perhaps the value of goods and services produced. Now any of these would be ways in which you might measure the size of the economy and say perhaps the UK economy is bigger than, say, the French economy. But as economists, we would normally focus on the bottom one, the value of goods and services produced. In this video, we're going to be looking at how the size of economies are measured, how economic growth is measured, and the difference between nominal and real values. So let's start off with the size of the economies. And as we said earlier, the value of all the items produced in that economy is normally how we measure the size. So if you picture in your mind the value of everything that's made in the UK, so add up all the cinema tickets, add up all the cars that are made, add up the value of all the restaurant meals, all the football tickets bought, all the hairdressing services that are provided. Add up the value of everything and you have the size of the economy. And in economics, we call that concept gross domestic product, or GDP. It's the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country in a year. This is an important definition to take down in your notes. It's normally estimated by governments, and it's often recorded in dollars so we can compare the size of one economy with another. So let's look at UK gross domestic product. And if we look at the value of the final markets, goods and services produced in the UK in a year, this line shows us what we get. And what you might start to see is there's a bit of a trend to it. Sometimes it's falling, sometimes it's rising. If you were to add it together and find out what it is in a year, you're looking at about £1.5 trillion per year. A huge, huge number. Now, as we saw there, economic output, the amount produced in the economy, typically varies over time, and we call these fluctuations the business cycle, or sometimes the economic or trade cycle. When GDP less is being produced and it's falling, we call that recession. When there is a low level of output in the economy, a slump or depression. When things start to improve and output, the amount produced in the economy rises, we call that recovery. And near the top, when things are above trend, we call that a boom. So what do you think are the top 10 economies by size in the world? You might want to pause the video, have a quick guess, and these are our answers. Looking round the world, the darker colour here represents larger GDP. The value produced by that country is greater. A lighter, more transparent colour represents a lower level of GDP. Now, you might start to think, is this the best way of actually comparing the size and the strengths of economies? For example, Italy and India might have quite similar sized economies in terms of what they produce, but would you say they're both equally strong? Maybe ask yourself the question, where would you like to live? So if just the size is not a particularly good way of measuring the strength of an economy, what might we use instead? And the answer to that is GDP per capita. Where GDP is the total value produced within a country in a year, GDP per capita is the output of a country divided by the number of people in the country. So it's GDP divided by the number of people in the country. So it's a better way of comparing living standards. So we ask that question again, what do you think is the top 10, but this time GDP per capita? What countries do you think make the top 10? Well, if we have a look, these countries that have a high value of output relative to their population make it near the top. You might notice that countries such as India and China with very large populations all of a sudden drop out of the rankings. So we've looked at how economies are measured. Let's now look at economic growth. Economic growth is the rate of change of economic output, and it's usually measured by changes in real GDP. It can be positive, the economy is growing, or it can be negative, the economy is shrinking. It can be actual, so how much is being produced, it's actually growing, or it could be potential, how much could be produced is growing or shrinking. An important definition here is 2 consecutive quarters, that's 2 3-month periods, so 6 months of negative growth we call a recession. Oh no, recession! Another way of illustrating economic growth is using a production possibility frontier. These curves illustrate the maximum an economy can produce given the resources available to it. So here, if we split our goods into 2 types, capital goods and consumer goods, this blue line represents the maximum amounts or combinations of those goods that an economy can produce. And if the curve shifts inwards, we would say that the economy has shrunk. What can be produced is less. And if the economy is only producing at point B, well inside what it could produce, then again that movement from A to B we would say is negative economic growth or a recession. So what has happened to UK growth? Well, generally speaking, most economies have tended to grow over time at maybe 2% per year. In the UK, that has been the trend over the longer term, but recently in 2008 and again in 2012 we experienced periods of negative economic growth, a large recession occurring in 2008 where the growth rate was negative. How does that compare to other economies around the world? Well, some economies are growing quite quickly, for example India and China at about 7–7.5%. Some economies growing quite slowly, like Japan. Some economies, like Brazil, are actually shrinking in size. So we looked at economic growth. Let's move on to look at nominal and real values. So I'm going to pose you a question. Imagine 1 million of products are produced in an economy and each are priced at £1. What would be the GDP, the gross domestic product, the value of all products produced in that economy? Well, you're right, it would be £1 million. Now let's suppose the following year 1 million products are still being produced, the same amount of products, but the prices have risen on average to £1.20. What would be the GDP now? What would be the gross domestic product, the total value of products produced? Well, you're right, it would be £1.2 million. Now, is this fair? Is this really economic growth? Is our economy producing more? Is it producing 20% more? Would that be fair? Now, some of you might argue yes, some of you might argue no, so we make a distinction in economics between these two things. We call GDP that includes the change of prices nominal GDP, and it's the value of all the goods and services produced and expressed in current prices in an economy. Real GDP is where we take the value of all goods and services produced, but we adjust for changes in prices in an economy. So this is often called in constant prices. We don't include the changes in price, we just look at the value using 1 year as a base year for prices. Again, these are 2 important concepts you need to have in your notes. So let's think about this real GDP and nominal GDP. Generally speaking, real GDP is a closer measure for the volume of goods produced than nominal GDP. Nominal GDP will normally be greater than real GDP because prices tend to rise over time, which we call inflation. And real GDP is often a preferred measure of economic growth because it shows us the performance of the economy without taking into account price rises. If you look at a comparison of the UK between real GDP growth and nominal GDP growth, you can see, generally speaking, real GDP growth has been lower than nominal growth because this one here doesn't include changes in price. That's it. Thank you.